She hadn't moved. The traffic light had changed twice. People were crossing all around her, but Margaret Sullivan stood frozen on that Portland Street corner because the man on the opposite sidewalk was someone she hadn't seen in 25 years. Someone she had spent 2 decades convincing herself she was over. His hair had gone silver. The lines in his face were new. But the way he stood, hands in his pockets, head tilted toward the water, was exactly the same. And then he turned. And he saw her. And he said her name. What she didn't know yet was that their story had never been what she thought it was. And what she was about to discover would change everything she believed about the last 25 years of her life. The first cold morning of October arrived in Portland the way it always did, without apology. Margaret Sullivan stepped out of her front door on Munjoy Hill and pulled her wool coat tighter around her shoulders, pausing just long enough to watch her breath turn to mist in the sharp morning air. The maple tree in her front yard had gone a deep, stubborn red overnight, and a handful of leaves spiraled down to the wet sidewalk below, indifferent to everything. She watched them for a moment longer than she needed to. These days, she often did that, stopped at small things, let herself linger inside them. Her therapist called it mindfulness. Maggie called it learning how to be alone. 18 months had passed since Thomas died. 18 months since she had stood in the main medical center corridor at 2 in the morning, holding a paper cup of cold coffee she never drank, while a doctor she barely knew explained in careful, gentle language that her husband of 21 years had not survived his second heart attack. 18 months of waking up on the right side of the bed out of habit, of cooking for 2 before catching herself, of turning to say something small and ordinary. Did you remember to call the plumber, or Ellen called again, and finding only the silence that had settled into the house like a permanent tenant? Thomas Sullivan had been a good man, a reliable man. The kind of man who remembered anniversaries and fixed things without being asked and laughed generously at other people's jokes. She had loved him, she was certain of that, even now, though it was a love that had grown slowly and quietly, like something tended in a garden rather than discovered all at once. They had built something real together, 2 adult sons, a house that finally felt like a home after years of effort, a life with shape and warmth and meaning. She did not take any of that lightly, but grief, she had learned, was not a simple thing. It did not arrive in a straight line or respect the logic of what you thought you felt. Sometimes it came for Thomas, for the specific weight of him in the bed beside her, for his particular laugh, for the knowledge that someone in the world had known exactly who she was for 2 decades. And sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, when the harbor wind came off Casca Bay and rattled the old window panes of the house, grief came for something else entirely. Something older, something she had spent 25 years convincing herself she had put to rest. She walked the 6 blocks to the Portland Public Library the way she did every morning, past the triple-deckers and the corner bakery that smelled of cinnamon and yeast, down the hill toward the old port where the streets turned to cobblestone and the buildings were brick and permanent. She had worked at the library for 19 years, first as a reference librarian, then as head of collections, and she still felt, every single morning she pushed through those heavy oak doors, a small and private satisfaction at the smell that greeted her. Old paper and wood polish and something she could never quite name, something that had no word in English, the smell of accumulated thought. She hung her coat, made coffee in the break room, and was arranging a new display of New England fiction near the front entrance when Ellen Marsh appeared from behind the periodicals shelf, clutching a travel mug and looking far too energized for 8:15 in the morning. "You look like you actually slept," Ellen said, stunning her with the unsentimental attention of someone who had been her best friend for 30 years. "I did," Maggie said, 6 whole hours. "That's practically a miracle for you." Ellen set her mug on the cart and began helping with the display, straightening a stack of Annie Proulx paperbacks with practiced efficiency. "I was thinking, and don't say no immediately, there's a thing at the Portland Museum of Art this Friday. Wine and Cheese, new exhibition on Maine coastal photography. Very low-key, Ruth is coming. Ruth is always coming to things, Maggie said, not unkindly. Thomas's sister had appointed herself Maggie's social coordinator in the months following his death, a role she performed with the dedicated energy of someone who believed strongly that widowhood was a condition best treated by cheese plates and cultural events. Ruth means well. I know she does. Maggie set the last book in place and stepped back to look at the display. I'll think about Friday. That means no. It means I'll think about it. Ellen gave her the look, the patient, worried look that Maggie had seen more times than she could count, and then let it go. That was one of the things she loved most about Ellen. She knew when to push and when to simply be present. It was a rare quality. The morning passed the way most mornings passed. Requests for research assistance, a school group touring the children's section, a long conversation with an elderly gentleman who needed help printing documents he had clearly been struggling with for days. Maggie helped him with quiet patience, walking him through each step twice, and felt the small, clean satisfaction that she always felt when a problem was genuinely solved. This was what she had always loved about the work. Not the books themselves, though she loved those too, but the moment of connection, the moment someone needed something and you could actually give it to them. It was nearly noon when the October light shifted and went gold through the tall library windows, and Maggie decided she would walk to the Old Port for lunch, the way she used to do when Thomas was alive. She had been avoiding the harbor district, she realized. Too many memories of Sunday afternoons of fresh lobster rolls at the counter of a place on Commercial Street that they had called their spot for years. But avoiding things she had decided somewhere between Session 8 and Session 9 of grief counseling was not the same as healing. She put on her coat, wrapped a scarf around her neck, and walked out into the October afternoon. She never made it to Commercial Street. Because at the corner of Congress and Exchange, where the pedestrian light was taking its time and a cold gust off the bay came sweeping up between the buildings, she looked up and saw Daniel Archer standing on the opposite sidewalk. 25 years collapsed like a paper wall. He was older, of course. The dark hair she remembered had gone mostly silver, and there were lines in his face that hadn't been there, and he was broader in the shoulders in the way men sometimes became with age. But the way he stood, slightly turned toward the water, hands in his jacket pockets, head tilted as though he was listening to something, was so completely, so specifically him that the breath left her body as though she had been struck. He turned, and he saw her. Neither of them moved. The light changed. People crossed around them. The harbor wind kept coming. Daniel Archer said her name. She couldn't hear it over the traffic and the distance, but she saw it on his lips, the shape of it, the two familiar syllables, Maggie. They stood inside Arabica Coffee on Free Street because it was the nearest place and because neither of them, apparently, was capable of suggesting something better. Maggie wrapped both hands around a ceramic mug of coffee she didn't particularly want and watched Dan add cream to his with the same slightly distracted gesture she remembered from 30 years ago, and thought, "This is the strangest moment of my life." "You're still here," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was more like a fact he was trying to absorb. "I'm still here," she confirmed. "You're not." "I've been in Seattle for 22 years. He looked up from his coffee. His eyes were the same. That was the thing that was undoing her. Everything else had changed. The years had done their work on both of them, but his eyes were exactly the same pale gray she remembered, the color of Casco Bay on a cloudy day. "I came back last month. My father's house. He passed in April. I've been dealing with the estate." "I'm sorry about your father." "Thank you." He paused. "I heard about Thomas." "I'm very sorry, Maggie." She looked up. "How did you, small city?" A small, careful smile. "I ran into Pete Gorman at a hardware store on Forest Avenue." "We talked for about 10 minutes. He told me, Pete Gorman." She hadn't thought about Pete Gorman in years, a mutual friend from the old days, from the version of Portland they had both inhabited when they were young, and the city had felt like the entire world. The network of shared history that accumulated over decades in a place, invisible, until it suddenly wasn't. How long are you staying? She asked. I'm not sure. He turned the mug in his hands. The house is almost sorted. I should go back. Sophie, my daughter, she's in Boston now, starting her second year of graduate school. Claire's mother is in Medford, and I try to check in on her when I can. He paused. Claire passed 8 months ago, cancer. I know, Maggie said, and then caught herself. Ellen told me she heard from someone. I'm sorry, Dan, he nodded. The silence between them was not entirely uncomfortable. It was the silence of people who had once known each other so thoroughly that they no longer needed to fill every space with words. Even after all this time, some residue of that remained. She wasn't sure whether to find that comforting or devastating. I thought about calling, he said. When I got back to Portland, I thought about it more than once. Why didn't you? He looked at her steadily. Because I didn't know if you'd want to hear from me. She almost laughed. Not cruelly, she wasn't cruel, and he hadn't done anything to deserve cruelty, but at the sheer accumulated weight of the misunderstanding that statement implied. 25 years of silence, and his explanation was that he hadn't known if she'd want to hear from him. As though she had been the one who stopped writing. As though she hadn't spent a year after he left waiting every single day for a letter. An explanation, anything. What happened, Dan? She asked. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. I need to understand what happened. Because for 25 years I thought you just left. That you decided we weren't worth fighting for and you moved on. Something shifted in his face. Something that looked like pain, not fresh pain, but the old, deep kind, the kind that had been sitting beneath the surface for a very long time. That's what you thought. What was I supposed to think? You stopped writing. You stopped calling. I wrote to your mother's address 3 times and heard nothing. And then someone told me you'd moved to Seattle and I thought she stopped. I thought I knew what it meant. He sat his mug down very carefully, as though he needed a moment to do something deliberate with his hands. When he looked up again, there was something in his expression she couldn't quite read. Maggie, he said, I wrote to you every week for 4 months. The coffee shop hummed around them, the grind of the espresso machine, the low murmur of conversations, the October wind pressing against the windows. Maggie heard all of it and none of it. What? After I moved to Seattle. I wrote to your parents' address because that's the only address I had for you, every week, sometimes twice a week. He held her gaze, and then your mother wrote back. The word landed between them like a stone into still water. My mother, Maggie said. She told me you'd met someone, that you were happy. That you'd asked her to tell me not to contact you again. He paused. I didn't believe it at first. I called, but your mother answered, and she said the same thing. She said you didn't want to speak to me, that you'd moved on and that I should do the same. The espresso machine hissed. Someone laughed at a table across the room. Maggie's mother, Patricia Walsh, had died of a stroke 7 years ago at the age of 78, in the same house in South Portland where Maggie had grown up, surrounded by her grandchildren and the Warren Catholic devotion that had organized her entire existence. She had been, by any reasonable measure, a loving and devoted mother. She had also been a woman of profound and unsentimental practicality, a woman who believed she understood what was best for her family and acted accordingly, and who had never entirely approved of Daniel Archer, the boy from the Falls neighborhood with the absent father and the uncertain future, the boy who had talked about art history and moving to New York City and had no particular plan for any of it. Maggie had known this. She had argued with her mother about it endlessly at 22 and 23. She had defended Dan with the passionate certainty of someone young enough to believe that love was the only argument that mattered. She had never imagined this. Dan, her voice broke slightly on the word and she steadied it. I never asked her to do that. I didn't know. I thought you were gone. I thought you'd made a choice. He looked at her for a long moment. In his face, she could see the arithmetic being done, 25 years of a story being quietly recalculated, all the grief reattributed, all the questions reassigned to their proper place. She let us believe we'd chosen this, he said finally. It wasn't anger in his voice. It was something quieter and harder. Understanding arriving too late, like a letter lost in the mail. Yes, Maggie said, she did. They sat with that for a while. Outside, the October light was moving across the cobblestones of the old port, and the first real chill of the season was settling into the city. And somewhere out on Casco Bay, a boat horn sounded, low and long, the way it had sounded on every October afternoon of Maggie's life in this place. After a time, Dan said, "Did you love him?" Thomas, it was a brave question. She gave it a brave answer. Yes, not the way. She stopped. Started again, differently, but yes. He was a good man and I loved him and our life together was real. Dan nodded slowly. Claire was a remarkable person. We were happy. I want you to know that. I'm not sitting here telling you I spent 25 years miserable. We had Sophie. We built something good. He paused. But I never entirely stopped wondering. Neither had she. She had never said it out loud, not to Thomas, not to Ellen, not to anyone, but it was true. In the private geography of her interior life, there had always been a place that belonged to Dan Archer, not a wound exactly. More like a scar you stop noticing until someone presses on it unexpectedly and you remember, with sudden sharp clarity, that it was once something much more significant. What do we do with this? She asked. He looked at her with those gray eyes, and for a moment she was 23 years old in Portland, Maine, and the whole world was still ahead of them. I don't know, he said. But I'd like to find out, if you would. Ellen Marsh had the particular gift of listening without commentary, which was why Maggie called her that evening rather than processing the afternoon alone in the house on Montreal, which she was fairly certain would result in either insomnia or excessive wine, or both. She told Ellen everything, standing at the kitchen window watching the lights of the harbor glitter in the early dark, her voice steady and low. When she finished, Ellen was quiet for several seconds. Patricia, Ellen said finally, just the name. 2 syllables of comprehensive judgment. She thought she was protecting me. She thought she was controlling you. Ellen, I'm not speaking ill of the dead, Maggie. I'm stating a documented fact. Your mother spent your entire 20s convinced she knew better than you about everything from your career to your haircut. A pause. I liked her. But I am not going to pretend she didn't do exactly what she did. Maggie pressed her forehead briefly against the cold glass of the window. She's gone. I can't. There's no conversation to have. There's no explanation or apology coming. She made a decision, and now I have to figure out what to do with the life that decision helped shape. What do you want to do with it? I don't know yet. Do you want to see him again? She didn't answer immediately, which was itself a kind of answer. Maggie, Ellen's voice was gentle. It's allowed. You're a 58-year-old widow and he's a 61-year-old widower, and you're both adults who have lived full, complicated lives. You're allowed to want things. She knew that. She didn't know that. And yet the wanting felt complicated in ways she struggled to articulate, even to herself. Because it wasn't just about Dan Archer, though it was certainly about him. It was about the years themselves, all those years of a life built on a false premise, a foundation that now had a crack running through it. She had chosen Thomas in the context of believing that Dan had left her. What did it mean that the context was wrong? Did it change anything about the choice itself, about the life that followed? Thomas had been her husband. She had loved him. She had been faithful to him, in every sense, for 21 years. She would not allow the revelation about her mother to retroactively diminish any of that. It would be dishonest, and it would be unfair to Thomas's memory. But she also couldn't pretend she felt nothing. And pretending, she had decided, was a form of smallness she could no longer afford. She met Dan the following Saturday at the Eastern Promenade because it was the place she had always gone when she needed to think. The long curving path above Casco Bay where Portland spread out behind you and the ocean spread out in front, and you could feel, with unusual clarity, exactly where you were in the world. It was cold, proper November cold now, the air carrying that particular main edge that announced winter's serious intentions, and they walked with their hands in their pockets and their breath misting ahead of them, and they talked. They talk the way people talk when they have 25 years to cover and not enough time to cover it properly, in long stretches and sudden tangents, circling back and forward, filling in the decades with names and places and the particular gravity of things lost and things found. He told her about Seattle, about the architectural firm where he'd worked for 18 years, about the house in Queenan that he and Claire had renovated entirely with their own hands over 3 summers. She told him about the library, about her sons, James, who was 32 and lived in Burlington with his wife and their 2 daughters, and Kevin, who was 29 and worked in Boston and called every Sunday with the dutiful regularity of a son who had been raised to call every Sunday. She told him about Thomas, more than she'd expected to, about who he had actually been, the specific texture of their life together, the grief she was still navigating. It felt important to be honest about all of it, to not simplify. Dan listened with his whole attention the way she remembered him doing. It was one of the things that had made her fall in love with him originally, at 22, at a party in someone's apartment on Danforth Street, the quality of his attention. The sense that when he was listening to you, he was not simultaneously thinking about what he would say next. They stopped near the overlook where a pair of park benches faced the bay. The November sky was low and gray, and Fort Gorges sat on its island in the middle distance, old and stoic and surrounded by cold water. "I need to tell you something," Dan said. He was looking at the fort rather than at her, which she recognized as his way of approaching difficult territory. He had always needed a fixed point in the distance when the conversation became serious, before this goes any further. "Whatever this is, all right," she said. "When my mother wrote back to me," he stopped, corrected himself. "When I believed your mother had written back, when I believed you'd moved on." He paused again, searching for the right word with the care of someone who knew how much words mattered. "I was devastated, but I was also angry. And that anger made me do something I've spent 25 years being ashamed of." She waited. "There was a man, a colleague at the first firm I worked for in Seattle, Richard Nakamura. He was having serious problems with a client, professional misconduct, and I knew about it. I found out by accident. And because I was angry at the world and not thinking clearly, I reported it to the partners in a way that was designed to hurt him rather than simply correct the problem. I framed it in a way that cost him his job and damaged his reputation significantly." He turned to look at her. It was cruel and cowardly and wrong. "I've made peace with it. Eventually, I actually found him years later and apologized. He'd rebuilt his career and his life. He was gracious about it. But I want you to know that I'm not, that I was capable of that. That grief made me capable of something I'm not proud of." Maggie looked at him for a long moment. "The wind came off the bay. Why are you telling me this?" "Because I don't want to start something built on the idea of who I was at 36 without acknowledging who I actually was at 36. He held her gaze. "And because if we're going somewhere, I wanted to be honest. Completely honest. No more stories that aren't true." She thought about her mother, about 25 years of a life shaped by someone else's deception. She thought about Thomas and the love she'd had for him and the love she had for this man and the complexity of holding all of it at the same time, which was, she was beginning to understand simply what it meant to be a person of a certain age with a certain history. "I appreciate you telling me," she said. "And I'd like the same courtesy in return, so here's mine." She told him about the year after she believed he'd left, the year she had spent in a particular darkness she had never fully described to anyone. The months of not eating properly, of going through professional motions with a hollow efficiency that had frightened Ellen enough to call Maggie's mother, which she now understood with bitter irony had only confirmed Patricia's sense that the whole business had been handled correctly. The slow reconstruction of herself that had followed. The deliberate, patient work of becoming someone capable of receiving Thomas Sullivan's steadiness and love. I blamed myself, she said, for years. I thought there had been something I'd missed, some sign that you were leaving that I should have seen. I thought I had loved you more than you loved me and hadn't been honest enough with myself about it. He flinched slightly, but she saw it, Maggie. I'm not telling you this to cause pain. I'm telling you because you were right. Completely honest, no more stories. She looked out at the gray bay. I'm also telling you because I survived it. I built a life. It was a real life, and I was genuinely happy in it for long stretches, and I don't want either of us to fall into the trap of thinking that everything before this moment was only waiting. He was quiet for a while, then he said, "When did you get so wise?" Despite everything, she laughed. It was a real laugh, sudden and warm, and it surprised her. 19 years in a library, she said. You read enough books about human nature. Eventually, some of it takes. The call came on a Tuesday evening in mid-November, when the first real snow was falling on Portland, not a storm, just the preliminary quiet kind, the snow that arrives to remind you what's coming. Maggie was sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of tea and a collection of Mary Oliver poems she had been meaning to finish for months when her phone lit up with Kevin's name. "Mom," her son said, "James told me about the man you've been spending time with." She set down her tea. "Your brother should mind his own business. He's worried. He called you to be worried together." "That's different." She kept her voice light. "Kevin, what do you actually want to say?" A long pause. She could hear the specific quality of his discomfort across 400 miles of phone connection. Kevin, who was like Thomas in so many ways, measured and careful and deeply private with his feelings, until they pressurized enough to demand release. "It's only been 18 months since Dad died. Mom, I know when your father died. Another pause. I don't want you to get hurt. That's kind, sweetheart. But that's not a decision you can make for me. Is it serious?" With this man, she thought about how to answer honestly. "I don't know yet. It's new. We're being careful." She paused. "But he was important to me once, a very long time ago. And I've learned some things recently that..." She stopped. She was not going to tell her son about her mother's interference. That story was hers to carry, and it was too complicated to translate accurately across a phone call. "He's a good person, Kevin, that much I know." Kevin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in a voice that was younger than his age, "Did you love him back then?" "Yes," she said. "Very much, more than you loved Dad." She felt the weight of the question, the genuine anxiety inside it, the need for reassurance, and beneath it all the particular tenderness of a son who had loved his father deeply and was trying to understand where that love fit now. "Differently," she said, which was the truest answer she had, not better or worse, differently. "Your father was one of the best people I've ever known, and what we had was real and worth everything we put into it. That doesn't change. It can't change, and it won't." She heard him exhale. "Okay," he said. "Okay, Mom, you and James could come home for Thanksgiving," she said. "Meet him, make up your own minds." A pause. Then, quietly, "Yeah, okay, I'd like that." She was still sitting at the kitchen table when Din knocked on her front door 20 minutes later, as they'd arranged to return a book she'd lent him, Colm Tóibín's Nora Webster, which she'd recommended somewhat deliberately, the story of a widow reconstructing herself after loss. He came in stamping snow from his boots and smelling of cold air and the pine soap she'd already begun to associate with him, and she poured him a cup of tea and told him about the call from Kevin, and he listened with his whole attention. "They're right to be cautious," he said. "So is Sophie. She called me yesterday. What did she say?" "She said she was glad I'd found someone to talk to. And then she asked me approximately 40 questions about who you were." He smiled slightly. "She's protective. She was very close to her mother." "That's as it should be. Yes." He wrapped his hands around the mug. "She also said," he paused, selecting his words carefully. "She said that her mother, a week before she died, told her that she hoped I wouldn't be alone. That Claire said she worried about that more than anything else, me being alone." The snow was falling past the kitchen window, soft and unhurried. The harbor lights were blurred and gentle through the glass. "She sounds like she was a remarkable person," Maggie said. "She was." He looked up. "You would have liked each other." "I think about that sometimes. It's a strange thing to think, but I do." "I don't think it's strange," Maggie said. "I think it means she mattered to you in a complete way." "That's not strange. That's love." He looked at her for a long moment. The kitchen was warm and the snow was falling and the harbor was out there in the dark, doing what it had always done, constant and indifferent and somehow comforting in its permanence. "Maggie," he said, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly, even if the answer is no." "All right. Is this," he stopped. "Is this something you actually want? Not because of your mother, not because of the injustice of what happened, not because it feels like something that was owed to you, but because you want it, because I'm what you want." He held her gaze. "Because I need it to be real. I can't. I'm 61 years old and I've buried people I loved and I don't have the patience anymore for things that aren't genuine." She understood exactly what he was asking. He was asking whether this was a response to the revelation about her mother, a reclamation of something stolen, or whether it was its own thing, new and present tense and chosen freely. She thought about it honestly, the way he deserved. She sat with the question and turned it over and looked at it from every angle available to her. Then she said, "I've been thinking about you since I was 23 years old. Not constantly, not in a way that prevented me from loving the life I had. But you were there, a small persistent presence. I used to think it was just the unresolved grief of being left. I understand now that it was something else." She paused. "When I saw you on that corner, I knew in the first 3 seconds. Before I knew anything about what had happened. Before any of this," she met his eyes. "So yes, it's real." He reached across the table and took her hand. Outside, the November snow kept falling on Portland, steady and quiet, covering everything with a thin white layer. All the old streets and the harbor and the old brick buildings and the maple tree in her front yard with its last stubborn leaves, and the city looked exactly the way it always had. Except that something inside the small warm kitchen on Munjoy Hill had quietly, irrevocably changed. Thanksgiving arrived in Portland with clear cold skies and the particular blue light that came only in late November, when the sun traveled low across the horizon and turned everything it touched into something that looked almost unbearably beautiful, the way things do just before winter truly closes in. James drove up from Burlington with his wife, Sarah, and their daughters, Lily, who was 7 and had recently developed strong opinions about everything, and May, who was 4 and had recently developed the habit of following her grandmother around the kitchen asking questions until the questions ran out and she simply stood there in comfortable silence, watching. Kevin flew in from Boston on Wednesday evening and sat up late in the kitchen with Maggie, the way he always had when he came home, drinking decaf and talking about his work and eventually, carefully, about what the last 18 months had been like for each of them, the particular grief of losing a father and a husband, the specific way that loss had rearranged the furniture of their respective inner lives. Dan arrived at 4 o'clock on Thanksgiving afternoon, carrying a bottle of Oregon Pinot Noir that Kevin later admitted was an excellent choice. and a small pot of homemade cranberry sauce that Sophie had emailed him the recipe for with detailed instructions and a footnote that read, "Don't mess this up, Dad." Maggie watched from the kitchen doorway as he shook Kevin's hand and held it a moment longer than a regular handshake, the way men sometimes do when they're trying to say something more complicated than words allow. She watched James assess him with the careful eyes of a firstborn son who had inherited his father's quiet thoroughness. She watched Lily explain at length the precise rules of a game she had invented, and watched Dan receive this information with complete and serious attention, asking to clarifying questions that made Lily's face light up with the specific joy of being taken seriously by an adult. She thought, here is a man I have known since before my sons were born. Here is a man I lost and found and am still in the process of learning all over again. After dinner, a sprawling, loud, slightly chaotic affair that ended with Sarah and Kevin washing dishes together while arguing cheerfully about Boston versus Burlington and James reading to Lily and May in the living room. Maggie and Dan stood on the front porch in their coats, looking out over Munjoy Hill at the harbor below, where the lights of the city reflected in the dark water. "That went well," he said. "It did," she agreed. "Kevin likes you. He interviewed me for approximately 40 minutes over appetizers. He's thorough. He's his father's son. From everything you've described," he paused. "I mean that as a compliment." "I know you do." She looked out at the harbor. "Sophie called this morning. She told me. She wanted to know if you were as interesting as I made you sound." "What did you tell her?" "I told her you were more interesting." He glanced sideways at her. "She's coming to Portland in January. She'd like to meet you, if you're willing." "I'm willing," Maggie said. "I'm looking forward to it." The harbor wind came up the hill, carrying the smell of cold salt water and wood smoke from someone's chimney nearby. The stars were extraordinary, the kind of clear November sky that reminded you the universe was vastly larger than anything happening inside the warm windows of any particular house. "Can I tell you something?" he said. "You can tell me anything. When I drove into Portland last month, when I came back after 22 years, I was not looking for this. I was not expecting anything except paperwork and memories and the particular sadness of closing up a parent's house." He paused. "I want you to know that I understand what a privilege it is. What happened to us was wrong and I'm still angry about it sometimes, in the way you're allowed to be angry about something you can't change. But I don't want to spend whatever time we have being angry at a woman who isn't here anymore. I'd rather spend it." He stopped. "I'd rather spend it here, with you, in Portland. In this absolutely absurd, improbable, extraordinary situation we've somehow ended up in." She turned to look at him fully. He was exactly 61 years old, with silver hair and gray eyes and the particular gravity of a person who had loved people and lost them and learned to carry both. He was not the 36-year-old she had spent 25 years grieving. He was better, more complete, more honest, more careful with the things that mattered. And she was not 23 anymore. And she was not the woman who had stood in a hospital corridor holding cold coffee while her world reorganized itself. She was 58, with 19 years of library work and 2 grown sons and a grief she was still navigating and a capacity for love she had never entirely managed to talk herself out of. "Then stay," she said. It was the simplest thing she had said in months. Maybe years. "Stay in Portland. Not for me, not yet. Not just for me. But don't go back to Seattle because you think you should. Stay because you want to, and let's find out what this actually is." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I already called the storage company about my things in Seattle." She stared at him. "When? 2 weeks ago." "Dan, I know. I know I wasn't going to say anything until I was sure you were going to stay anyway." He had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "I was going to stay regardless. Portland is my city too. I grew up here. My father's house is here. Sophie is 4 hours away in Boston." A pause. "But yes." You were a significant part of the calculation." She laughed again, the same surprised, genuine laugh she'd had on the Eastern Promenade, and shook her head. And then she did something she hadn't done in a very long time. She leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder in the way that people do when the argument for a thing is simply too strong to keep resisting. He put his arm around her, and they stood there on the front porch on Mundry Hill on Thanksgiving evening, looking out at the harbor and the cold dark bay and the lights of Portland, Maine, the same city and a completely different world. Inside, she could hear her son's voices and the high bright laughter of her granddaughters and the sound of someone, probably Kevin, singing off-key to something in the kitchen, the sounds of a life. A real, complicated, deeply imperfect, thoroughly worth having life, she thought about her mother. She let herself feel the grief and anger of that, honestly, without pushing it away. Patricia Walsh had been a woman of great love and great stubbornness and significant certainty about things she should have been less certain about. She had done something wrong out of what she believed were the right reasons, and the cost had been enormous and could not be calculated cleanly or recovered entirely. That was true, and Maggie would not unsay it. But she also thought about Thomas and the genuine warmth of 21 years and her sons who were inside her house right now making noise and being alive. She thought about all the days she would not trade. The specific way Thomas had laughed at bad puns, the summer they had taken the boys to Acadia and James had caught his first fish and been simultaneously thrilled and horrified. The Tuesday evenings with the Mary Oliver poems and the cup of tea and the ordinary unexamined contentment of a life well lived. You could not draw a straight line from here to there and call it loss. It was more complicated than that. It was, she thought, simply life, the whole unruly, accidental, irreducible thing. The harbor wind moved through the bare maple branches in the front yard. Dawn's arm tightened slightly around her shoulders, just enough to notice, she thought, here I am. 58 years old, in Portland, Maine, on a cold November evening, with my sons inside and the whole winter ahead and a man I have known half my life who has somehow, against every reasonable probability, come back to stand beside me on a porch and look at the same stars. And she thought, this is not the story I planned. But then, which of the best ones ever are? Somewhere out on Casco Bay, a boat moved through the dark water, its running light small and steady and warm. Navigating by instruments and memory and the particular knowledge of people who know a harbor well, who have learned over the long years exactly where the rocks are, exactly how deep the water runs, exactly how to come home safely through the dark.